This story is inspired by real-life struggles of loss, love, and second chances many families quietly live through every day. Subscribe to the Daily Vitality Dose so you don't miss this journey and more heartfelt stories like it as we dive into the full tale. Sarah noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the maple trees outside her mother's kitchen window had just begun their transformation into flames of orange and gold. She had stopped by after work, as she did every week, carrying a bag of groceries and her mother's favorite lemon cookies from the bakery on Fifth Street. Margaret Chen sat at the kitchen table, staring at a half-completed crossword puzzle with an expression Sarah had never seen before. It wasn't confusion exactly, nor was it frustration. It was something closer to fear, raw and unguarded, like a child lost in a crowded store. "Mom?" Sarah set the groceries on the counter. "Everything okay?" Margaret looked up, and for the briefest moment, there was nothing in her eyes. No recognition, no warmth, just a blank uncertainty that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Then, like a light switching on, her mother smiled. "Sarah, I didn't hear you come in." Margaret rose from her chair, smoothing down her cardigan in that characteristic gesture Sarah had known all her life. "I was just working on this silly puzzle. Can't seem to remember a seven-letter word for reminiscence. Isn't that ironic?" Sarah laughed, but the sound felt hollow in her throat. "Memory," she said quietly. "Of course, memory." Margaret picked up her pencil, then set it down again. "I knew that." Over the next hour, as they unpacked groceries and prepared dinner together, Sarah cataloged a dozen small irregularities. Her mother put the milk in the cupboard instead of the refrigerator. She asked twice what time Sarah had arrived. She stumbled over the name of Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor of 20 years, calling her that woman next door instead. These were small things, barely noticeable individually, but together they formed a pattern that Sarah couldn't ignore, though she desperately wanted to. "How have you been feeling, Mom?" Sarah asked as they sat down to eat the chicken stir-fry they'd made together, a recipe Margaret had prepared thousands of times over the years. "Oh, fine, fine." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Getting old, that's all. The mind isn't what it used to be." "Have you mentioned anything to Dr. Morrison about memory issues?" Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I'm 73 years old, Sarah. I'm allowed to be a little forgetful." There was an edge to her voice now, defensive and sharp. "You worry too much. Always have." Sarah wanted to press, but she recognized that tone. It was the same one her mother had used when Sarah was 16 and had suggested very gently that perhaps her father's drinking was becoming a problem. Margaret Chen did not like to admit weakness, not in herself and not in those she loved. After dinner, Sarah washed dishes while her mother dried them and put them away. They fell into the familiar rhythm they'd developed over decades, a comfortable silence punctuated by occasional observations about Sarah's work at the hospital, Margaret's book club, the state of the neighborhood. "Do you remember when you were 8, Margaret said suddenly, "and you decided you wanted to be a doctor?" Sarah smiled. "I remember. I just read that book about Clara Barton. You were so determined. You spent an entire summer bandaging every stuffed animal in the house." Margaret's eyes were distant, focused on something Sarah couldn't see. "Your father said you'd change your mind, but I knew better. I always knew." "You did," Sarah agreed softly. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I hope you know that." "I do, Mom." But as Margaret reached up to put a plate in the cabinet, she hesitated, her hand hovering in the air as if she'd forgotten where it belonged. Sarah watched as her mother opened first one cabinet, then another, before finally finding the right one. The whole episode lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When Sarah left that evening, she sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. The September air was cooling quickly, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the darkness. Through the kitchen window, she could see her mother moving about, putting things away, living her life as she always had. Sarah pulled out her phone and typed a message to her brother, James, who lived 2 states away with his wife and twin daughters. "We need to talk about Mom." She stared at the words for a long moment before deleting them. She wasn't ready, not yet. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe her mother was right, and this was just normal aging, nothing to worry about. But as she drove home through the quiet suburban streets, past the houses with their glowing windows and the lives contained within them, Sarah couldn't shake the image of her mother's face when she'd first walked in. That moment of blankness, of absence, of her mother being somewhere Sarah couldn't follow. She'd seen that look before, of course. She was a doctor, a geriatric specialist at Memorial Hospital. She'd seen it in countless patients, in the worried faces of their families, in the inevitable progression that followed. She knew all the stages, all the symptoms, all the statistics. But this was different. This was her mother, the woman who had taught her to read, who had stayed up with her through every childhood illness, who had been her constant, her anchor, her home. That night, Sarah lay awake in her apartment, listening to the distant sounds of the city. She thought about time, about memory, about all the things she'd taken for granted. She thought about her mother's hands, strong and capable, guiding her through homework and heartbreak and every milestone in between. And she thought about loss, about the cruelest kind of disappearance, where the person you love is still there, still breathing, still speaking, but somehow, gradually, inexorably, slipping away. At 3 in the morning, she got out of bed and found the photo album her mother had made for her 30th birthday. She turned the pages slowly, studying each image. Her mother holding her as a newborn, both of them squinting in the hospital lights. Her mother helping her blow out candles on her 6th birthday. Her mother in the audience at her high school graduation, her medical school graduation, always there, always watching, always remembering. Sarah closed the album and held it against her chest. Please, she whispered to no one, to everyone, to whatever force governed these things. Not yet. Please, not yet. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were futile. Whatever was happening to her mother had already begun, and no amount of pleading would stop it. 3 months later, Sarah sat in Dr. Morrison's office with her mother and brother, waiting for words that would change everything. The neurologist's office was decorated in soothing blues and greens, with landscape paintings on the walls and a small fountain trickling peacefully in the corner. It was designed to be calming, Sarah knew, a buffer against the devastating news delivered within these walls. Margaret sat between her 2 children, her hands folded primly in her lap. She dressed carefully for this appointment, in her good navy slacks and the pearl earrings Sarah's father had given her on their 25th anniversary. Even now, facing this appointment with the neurologist after months of tests and scans, Margaret Chen maintained her dignity. James had flown in the night before. At 45, he was 3 years older than Sarah, with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's dark eyes. He'd taken one look at Margaret when he arrived and turned to Sarah with a question in his expression that she'd answered with a slight shake of her head. It was worse than he'd expected. Dr. Morrison entered with a manila folder and a gentle expression that Sarah recognized from her own practice. It was the look doctors cultivated when they were about to break someone's world open. "Thank you for coming in," Dr. Morrison began, settling into his chair. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he'd been Margaret's doctor for over a decade. "I know this hasn't been an easy few months." It had started in October, after Sarah had finally convinced her mother to see the doctor. A simple screening test had led to more tests. Blood work to rule out vitamin deficiencies and thyroid problems, an MRI to check for strokes or tumors, a neuropsychological evaluation that had taken 3 hours and left Margaret exhausted and irritable. "Let's just get on with it," Margaret said now, her voice steady. "I'm not a child. Whatever it is, I can handle it." Dr. Morrison nodded. "You've completed a comprehensive series of evaluations, Margaret. The MRI showed some atrophy in the hippocampus and temporal lobes, which is consistent with what we suspected. Combined with your performance on the cognitive assessments and the progression of symptoms over the past several months, I'm confident in the diagnosis." He paused, and in that pause, Sarah felt time stretch and thin. "You have Alzheimer's disease, Margaret. Early to moderate stage." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had expected them, had known they were coming, but hearing them spoken aloud made them real in a way all her preparation couldn't prevent. Beside her, she felt James go rigid. "I see," Margaret said, and her voice was remarkably calm. "And what does that mean exactly? In plain English?" Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "Alzheimer's is a progressive disease that affects memory, thinking, and behavior. Right now, you're experiencing mild to moderate symptoms, some memory loss, difficulty with complex tasks, occasional confusion about time and place. As the disease progresses, these symptoms will worsen." "How long?" Margaret asked. "It varies from person to person. Some people decline rapidly, others more slowly. On average, people live 4 to 8 years after diagnosis, but some live as long as 20 years. 20 years, Sarah thought. 20 years of watching her mother disappear piece by piece. What about treatment? James asked, speaking for the first time. His voice was rough, choked. There are medications that can help slow the progression, at least temporarily. Donepezil, memantine. They won't stop the disease, but they may help maintain function for a while longer. We'll start Margaret on those right away. Dr. Morrison continued talking about clinical trials and support groups, about the importance of staying physically and mentally active, about advanced directives and future planning. Sarah heard the words, processed them professionally, but emotionally she felt like she was underwater, everything distant and muffled. I want to drive home, Margaret said suddenly, interrupting the doctor. Everyone looked at her. I want to drive myself home, she repeated. I can still do that, can't I? Dr. Morrison exchanged a glance with Sarah. For now, yes. But Margaret, there will come a time, probably sooner rather than later, when driving won't be safe anymore. But not today. Not today, he agreed. Outside in the parking lot, they stood in a tight circle, none of them quite ready to separate and face what came next. I need some time, Margaret said. Alone. I'll drive home, and you two can come by later. For dinner, maybe. Mom, I don't think, Sarah began, but Margaret cut her off. I'm still capable of spending an afternoon alone in my own house, Sarah. Don't take that from me, not yet. So they let her go, watching as she drove away in her silver Honda Civic, the car she'd owned for 12 years and could probably drive in her sleep. James turned to Sarah, and she saw tears on his face for the first time since their father's funeral 8 years ago. How long have you known? He asked. I suspected in September, but I hoped I was wrong. They stood there for a long moment, two middle-aged children trying to process the fact that their mother was dying, would die, was already dying in the way that mattered most. What do we do now? James asked. Sarah thought about all the families she'd counseled through this process, all the advice she'd given about taking things one day at a time, about focusing on quality of life, about finding moments of connection even as the disease progressed. It all seemed hollow now, theoretical, like instructions for a journey she'd never actually taken. We love her, Sarah said finally. We love her while we still can. That evening, they gathered at Margaret's house, the house where they'd both grown up. Margaret made her famous beef stew, moving around the kitchen with the efficiency of decades of practice. Except she forgot to add salt, and she asked James twice to set the table, and halfway through dinner, she looked around with confusion and asked, Where's your father? An awkward silence fell. Dad died 8 years ago, Mom, James said gently. Remember? Heart attack. Margaret's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked lost and old and frightened. Then she collected herself. Of course. I'm sorry. I don't know where my mind went. It's okay, Mom, Sarah said, but it wasn't okay. And they all knew it. After dinner, they sat in the living room, and Margaret said, I want to talk about the future, while I still can. So they talked, about power of attorney and healthcare directives, about whether Margaret would eventually need to move in with one of them or into a facility, about all the practical, terrible things that needed to be discussed. I don't want to burden you, Margaret said at one point, her voice breaking. Either of you. You have your own lives. You're not a burden, James said fiercely. You're our mother. When they finally left, well after midnight, Sarah hugged her mother at the door, holding on perhaps a moment too long. I'm scared, Margaret whispered against Sarah's shoulder, the first time she'd admitted it. I know, Mom. I'm scared too. I don't want to forget you or James or any of it. All these memories, everything we've been through together. I don't want to lose it. I'll remember for both of us, Sarah promised, knowing even as she said it that it wasn't enough, could never be enough. Driving home, Sarah thought about memory, about how we are made of our experiences, our recollections, the accumulated weight of all the moments that came before. What did it mean to lose that? To still exist, but to have no past, no context, no connection to the person you once were? She thought about her mother's hands, already starting to forget how to button a shirt, how to hold a pen, how to reach for the people she loved. She thought about her mother's mind, that sharp, loving mind that had guided her through childhood, slowly dimming like a light on a timer, fading into darkness, and she cried for the first time since the diagnosis, ugly, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, crying for her mother and for herself and for all the conversations they wouldn't have, All the memories that would be lost, all the versions of her mother she would watch disappear. The first year after the diagnosis was a study in gradual loss, a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded in 1,000 small surrenders. Margaret gave up driving in February after she got lost trying to find her way home from the grocery store and had to call Sarah from a gas station 3 towns away. She'd tried to hide how frightened she'd been, but Sarah had seen it in her eyes when she arrived to pick her up. "I just took a wrong turn," Margaret had insisted. "Could happen to anyone." But they both knew it was more than that. The next week, Sarah quietly removed the car keys from her mother's purse and put them in a drawer. Margaret pretended not to notice, but sometimes Sarah caught her standing at the living room window, watching the car sit unused in the driveway. That silver Civic that represented independence and freedom, now just a hunk of metal gathering dust. Spring brought new challenges. Margaret forgot to pay her bills, and the electricity was shut off before Sarah discovered stacks of unopened envelopes stuffed into a kitchen drawer. She set up automatic payments and took over her mother's finances, trying to do it gently, trying to preserve what dignity she could. "I can manage my own money," Margaret protested. "I know you can, Mom. I'm just helping out a little." But they both knew it was more than helping out. It was taking over, assuming control, becoming the parent while Margaret became the child. The role reversal was jarring, uncomfortable, painful for them both. The medications helped, at least initially. For a few months, Margaret seemed more like herself, more present. But by summer, the decline resumed its inevitable march. James visited when he could, flying in for long weekends, video calling every Sunday. His daughters, 13-year-old twins named Emma and Lily, would crowd around the phone, chattering about school and soccer and their latest obsessions. Sometimes Margaret followed along perfectly, laughing at their jokes and asking appropriate questions. Other times she would stare at the screen with that blank expression Sarah had come to dread, unable to remember who these chattering girls were or why they were calling her grandma. "I'm losing her," James said to Sarah during one visit, his voice thick with grief. "Every time I come, she's a little further away." Sarah wanted to comfort him, but she had no comfort to give. She was barely holding herself together. In August, Margaret's neighbor called Sarah at the hospital. "Your mother is wandering," Mrs. Patterson said. "I found her in my backyard this morning at 6 a.m., wearing her nightgown. She said she was looking for her mother." Margaret's mother had been dead for 30 years. That evening, Sarah and her mother had a difficult conversation. "I think it's time we looked at other living arrangements," Sarah said carefully. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger and fear. "You want to put me in a home, like I'm some kind of invalid. I want you to be safe, Mom. I want to know you're being cared for." "I can care for myself." But she couldn't, not really, not anymore. She left burners on, forgot to lock doors, took her medications twice or not at all despite the pill organizer Sarah had set up. She was becoming a danger to herself, and they both knew it. In September, almost exactly a year after Sarah had first noticed the signs, Margaret moved in with Sarah. It wasn't ideal. Sarah's 2-bedroom apartment was cramped for 2 people, and the arrangement required significant adjustments from them both. But it was better than the alternative, at least for now. Sarah converted her home office into a bedroom for her mother, filling it with familiar things from Margaret's house: her favorite armchair, the quilt her own mother had made, photographs on every surface. She hoped the familiar objects would provide comfort, stability, something to hold on to as everything else slipped away. The first few weeks were rocky. Margaret would wake in the night, confused and frightened, calling out for Sarah's father. She would forget where she was, would try to leave, would insist she needed to go home without understanding that home didn't exist anymore. Not in the way she remembered. Sarah learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest sound. She installed locks on the doors that required keys, hating herself for it, but knowing it was necessary. She couldn't risk her mother wandering outside in the middle of the night. Work became increasingly difficult. Sarah was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, trying to be present for her patients while her own mother occupied her every thought. She reduced her hours, taking a part-time position that her colleagues understood, but that made her feel like she was failing everyone. "You're doing the right thing," her colleague, Dr. Ramirez, told her. "Family comes first." But it didn't feel right. It felt like drowning, like being pulled under by a current she couldn't fight. James sent money, called often, visited when he could, but he had his own family, his own responsibilities. The day-to-day care fell to Sarah, and some days the weight of it was crushing. There were good moments too, though. Afternoons when Margaret was lucid and they could talk like they used to, almost like before. They would sit together on the couch looking through photo albums, and for a while Margaret would remember everything. She would tell stories about Sarah's childhood, about her own youth, about Sarah's father when they were first married. He was so handsome, Margaret would say, studying a photo of a young man with dark hair and an easy smile. And so stubborn. You get that from him. I thought I got it from you, Sarah would tease, and her mother would laugh, that bright, genuine laugh that Sarah had heard all her life. Those moments were precious, sacred, and Sarah held on to them desperately. But they were becoming rarer. By October, Margaret no longer recognized Mrs. Patterson when she came to visit. By November, she sometimes forgot James's name, calling him that nice young man, or simply not knowing who he was at all. She still knew Sarah, though. She always knew Sarah. You're the one who takes care of me, Margaret would say, patting Sarah's hand. You're very kind. It broke Sarah's heart every time, this reduction of their entire relationship to a simple caregiver dynamic. She wanted to shout, I'm your daughter. You gave birth to me. You taught me to ride a bike and read and be brave. But instead, she would just hold her mother's hand and say, I'm happy to help. In December on Christmas morning, Sarah woke to find her mother standing in front of the small tree Sarah had decorated, tears streaming down her face. Mom? What's wrong? Margaret turned to her, and for a moment, she was completely present. I know what's happening to me, she said quietly. I know I'm losing everything. And I'm so sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry you have to watch this. Sarah held her mother while they both cried, grieving for what was already lost and what would be lost still. I love you, Mom, Sarah whispered. No matter what happens, I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. Even when I can't remember your name, even when I don't know who you are, I'll still love you. That's the one thing I'm sure of. It was the last completely lucid conversation they would ever have. The day Sarah had dreaded came on a Tuesday in March, 18 months after the diagnosis. She'd come home from work to find her mother sitting in the living room, exactly where Sarah had left her that morning, still wearing her robe and slippers. The television was on, playing a rerun of some cooking show neither of them watched. Hi, Mom, Sarah said, setting down her bag and hanging up her coat. How was your day? Margaret looked up at her, and Sarah saw confusion in her eyes. Not the typical confusion of forgetting what day it was or what she'd eaten for breakfast. This was something deeper, more fundamental. I'm sorry, Margaret said politely. Who are you? The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd known this would happen eventually. She'd counseled dozens of families through this exact moment, but knowing it was coming and experiencing it were entirely different things. I'm Sarah, she managed to say, her voice surprisingly steady. Your daughter. Margaret studied her face, searching for recognition that didn't come. I have a daughter named Sarah. She's little, though. She has pigtails and a missing front tooth. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes but forced them back. Her mother didn't need to see her cry. I grew up, Mom. I'm 42 now. 42? Margaret looked bewildered. That can't be right. I'm only 42. Sarah sat down beside her mother, careful not to move too quickly or seem threatening. She'd learned these things from her training, from books, from support groups. She'd learned how to navigate this new reality where her mother was a stranger who needed to be approached with caution and gentleness. You're 74, Sarah said softly, and I take care of you. Oh, Margaret considered this information. That's very kind of you, but I should probably go home. My mother will worry. Your mother died a long time ago, Mom. Margaret's face crumpled. She did. Yes, I'm sorry. They sat in silence for a while, and slowly, gradually, some awareness seemed to return to Margaret's eyes. Sarah? Yes, Mom, I'm here. I forgot you for a minute. I know, it's okay. It's not okay. Margaret's hands were shaking. What's happening to me? How do you explain to someone that their mind is betraying them, that they're losing themselves piece by piece? How do you tell your mother that she's disappearing? You have Alzheimer's, Sarah said gently. It makes you forget things sometimes. That's right. I remember now. I have that disease. Margaret looked down at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. I'm scared, Sarah. I know, Mom. But I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. That evening, Sarah called James. She tried to be clinical, to report the facts without emotion, but her voice broke halfway through. She didn't know who I was, James. For the first time, she looked at me like I was a complete stranger. I'm sorry, James said, and she could hear the helplessness in his voice. I'm so sorry. It's going to get worse, isn't it? Yes. They didn't say anything else for a long moment. What was there to say? Over the following weeks, the pattern became clear. Some days, Margaret knew Sarah perfectly well. They would have conversations, share meals, watch television together like always. Other days, Sarah was a stranger, a nice woman who lived in the apartment and sometimes helped with things. Sarah learned to gauge each day within the first few minutes of interaction. She learned to reintroduce herself when necessary, to accept whatever reality her mother was living in, rather than trying to force her back to this one. The key, her support group facilitator had said, is to meet them where they are. So if Margaret thought Sarah was a nurse, Sarah became a nurse. If Margaret thought Sarah was a friend from church, Sarah became that friend. She became whoever her mother needed her to be. But on the days when Margaret didn't know her at all, when she looked at Sarah with fear or suspicion, when she demanded to know what the stranger was doing in her house, those days were the hardest. Sarah would retreat to her own room and cry, mourning the mother who was still alive but already gone in all the ways that mattered. The home health aide started coming 3 days a week, giving Sarah some respite. Carmen was in her 50s, with warm eyes and infinite patience. She'd been doing this work for 20 years and had seen it all. She asked about you today, Carmen told Sarah one afternoon when she arrived home from work. She said, "Where's my daughter? When is Sarah coming home?" She knew you, even though she didn't remember your name. Sarah clung to these moments like lifelines, evidence that somewhere deep inside her mother still knew her, still loved her, still remembered. By summer, Margaret's vocabulary had shrunk dramatically. She struggled to find words for simple objects, calling everything the thing or that stuff. She would start sentences and lose the thread halfway through, trailing off into confused silence. She needed help with everything now: bathing, dressing, eating. Sarah learned to cut her mother's food into small pieces, to guide the fork to her mouth, to wipe her face like you would a child's. The indignity of it haunted Sarah. Her mother had been so proud, so independent. What would she think if she could see herself now? But there were still moments of unexpected grace. One evening in July, Sarah was helping her mother get ready for bed, and Margaret suddenly looked at her with perfect clarity. "You're so good to me," she said. "It's what you did for me, Mom. When I was little. Did I do it well? Was I a good mother?" Sarah's throat tightened. "You were the best mother, the very best." Margaret smiled, seemingly satisfied, and then the moment passed and she was gone again, lost somewhere Sarah couldn't follow. That night, Sarah dreamed of her mother as she'd been before, vibrant, sharp, fully present. They were in the kitchen of Sarah's childhood home, and her mother was teaching her how to make dumplings, her strong hands guiding Sarah's clumsy ones, both of them laughing at the misshapen results. She woke with tears on her face and the certainty that she would never stop missing the mother she'd lost, even though she was still here, still breathing, still taking up space in the world. The cruelest thing about Alzheimer's, Sarah thought, was that it gave you 1,000 goodbyes instead of one. Each lost skill, each forgotten memory, each moment of non-recognition was another small death, another piece of the person you love slipping away. And all you could do was hold on and try to love them through it, even when they no longer knew who you were. 2 years after the diagnosis, Margaret moved into Willowbrook Memory Care Facility. It was a clean, bright place with a garden courtyard and staff who spoke in gentle tones and touched their residents with genuine affection. Sarah had toured 7 facilities before choosing this one, and still the decision felt like betrayal. "I can't do it anymore," she'd sobbed to James over the phone. "I can't keep her safe. I can't be everything she needs." "No one expects you to," James had said, but Sarah expected it of herself. Margaret had stopped eating regularly, would refuse her medications, would wander at night despite all the locks and alarms. She'd fallen twice, fortunately, without serious injury, but it was only a matter of time. Sarah was exhausted, burned out, barely functioning herself. The decision to move her mother to professional care was both the hardest and the most obvious choice she'd ever made. Margaret's room at Willowbrook was small but comfortable, with space for a bed, a dresser, and her favorite armchair by the window. Sarah had covered the walls with photographs, dozens of them, images of Margaret's whole life, her wedding day, holding her babies, standing in front of the house she'd lived in for 40 years. She probably won't recognize them, the facility director had told Sarah gently, but they might provide comfort anyway. Margaret didn't fight the move. She didn't really understand it. She'd long since lost the ability to comprehend what was happening to her or why. Sarah visited every day after work and on weekends. She would sit with her mother holding her hand, talking about nothing and everything. Sometimes Margaret would seem to listen, would nod or smile at appropriate moments. Other times, she would stare out the window, seeing things Sarah couldn't see, living in a time Sarah couldn't reach. "Tell me about when you were young," Sarah would say, because sometimes the old memories were still there, buried but retrievable. And occasionally Margaret would remember. She would talk about growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown, about her parents' restaurant, about meeting Sarah's father at a dance in 1962. The stories would come out fragmented and jumbled, pieces of a puzzle scattered across decades, but they would come. Sarah recorded these conversations on her phone, preserving every word. She was creating an archive of her mother's voice, her stories, the remnants of who she'd been. James came to visit in September, bringing Emma and Lily. The girls were 14 now, on the cusp of womanhood, full of opinions and energy. They approached their grandmother tentatively, unsure how to act around this woman who shared their DNA but didn't know their names. "Hi, Grandma," Emma said softly. Margaret looked at the girls with delight. "Such beautiful children. Are they yours?" she asked, turning to Sarah. "They're James's daughters, Mom. Your granddaughters." "Oh," Margaret smiled at them anyway. "What pretty girls." Later in the parking lot, Lily cried. "She doesn't know us," she said. "She doesn't even know who we are." "She loves you anyway," Sarah told her nieces. "Even when she doesn't remember, some part of her still loves you. That doesn't go away." She hoped it was true. By winter, Margaret had stopped speaking almost entirely. She would make sounds, murmurs, and sighs, but no words. Sarah didn't know if she'd forgotten how to speak or simply had nothing left to say. The staff at Willowbrook was wonderful, treating Margaret with dignity and kindness, even as she became less and less responsive. They would brush her hair, paint her nails, dress her in the soft clothes Sarah brought from home. They would sit with her in the courtyard when the weather was nice, pointing out birds and flowers, talking to her even though she never answered back. "We treat every resident as if they're fully present," one of the nurses told Sarah, "because maybe they are, somewhere inside." Sarah wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that her mother was still in there, trapped behind walls of dying neurons and tangled proteins, aware but unable to communicate. But she also hoped it wasn't true, because that would be its own kind of torture. On a Saturday in early March, 3 years after the diagnosis, Sarah arrived at Willowbrook to find her mother more agitated than usual. Margaret was pacing in her room, pulling at her clothes, making distressed sounds. "She's been like this all morning," the aide told Sarah. "We can't figure out what's wrong." Sarah approached her mother slowly. "Mom, it's me. It's Sarah." Margaret looked at her, and in her eyes, Sarah saw something she hadn't seen in months. Not recognition exactly, but awareness. Connection. "Mama," Margaret said suddenly, clearly. It was the first word she'd spoken in weeks. Sarah's heart seized. "I'm right here, Mom." "Mama," Margaret said again, reaching for Sarah with trembling hands. And Sarah understood. Her mother wasn't calling out for her own long-dead mother. She was calling Sarah Mama. Their roles had reversed so completely that now Sarah was the mother and Margaret was the child, seeking comfort from the one person she could still, somehow, feel connected to. Sarah pulled her mother into her arms, holding her while Margaret cried without tears, that dry, awful sobbing of someone who'd forgotten how to weep properly. "Shh," Sarah murmured, rocking her gently. "It's okay. I'm here. I've got you." She held her mother until the agitation passed, until Margaret relaxed in her arms and the distressed sounds faded to quiet breathing. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, thinking about the word Mama and all it meant. Her mother had given her life, had raised her, had been her first source of comfort and safety. And now at the end, Sarah was doing the same for her. The circle was completing itself in the most painful way possible. She thought about all the things she'd lost, conversations about her day, advice about life decisions, her mother's laughter, her mother's stories, her mother's recognition of who Sarah was. She thought about all the things she would never have, her mother at her wedding if she ever got married, her mother as a grandmother to her own children if she ever had them, her mother as a friend in her old age. But she also thought about what remained. Love remained, even without memory. Connection remained, even without recognition. The fundamental bond between mother and daughter persisted, wordless and nameless, but still present, still real. The months that followed were a slow fade to black. Margaret stopped walking, stopped sitting up on her own, stopped opening her eyes most of the time. She was moved to the facility's hospice wing, where the lights were softer and the nurses spoke in whispers. "It won't be long now," the hospice nurse told Sarah gently. "Days, maybe a week or two." Sarah took leave from work. She spent every day at her mother's bedside, holding her hand, talking to her, playing music from Margaret's youth. She read aloud from her mother's favorite books, recited poems Margaret had once memorized, told stories about their life together. "Do you remember," Sarah would say, "when I was 7 and fell off my bike and you carried me 3 blocks home? Do you remember teaching me to make dumplings? Do you remember the summer we drove to the Grand Canyon and the car broke down in Nevada?" Margaret never answered, but Sarah talked anyway. She talked about everything and nothing, filling the silence with words, with memories, with love. James came and stayed in Sarah's apartment. Together they kept vigil, taking turns sitting with their mother, each processing grief in their own way. "I can't remember the last time she said my name," James confessed one night. "I've been trying to think of it, and I just can't remember." "June," Sarah said quietly. "Last June, when you called on her birthday. She talked to you for 5 minutes, and she called you James 3 times. I remember because I thought it might be the last time, so I paid attention." James looked at her with something between gratitude and sorrow. "You remember for all of us now. Someone has to." On a Thursday afternoon in late March, with spring struggling to arrive outside the window, Margaret's breathing changed. It became slower, more labored, with long pauses between each breath. Sarah called James, who was at her apartment sleeping. "Come now," was all she said. They sat on either side of their mother's bed, each holding one of her hands. Margaret's eyes were closed, had been closed for days, but Sarah thought she could sense their presence. "It's okay, Mom," Sarah whispered. "You can go. We'll be okay." James was crying silently, tears streaming down his face. "We love you," he said. "We'll always love you." Margaret took another breath, then another, each one farther apart than the last. And then, so gently it was almost imperceptible, she simply stopped. The room was very quiet. Through the window, Sarah could hear birds singing, oblivious to the fact that the world had just lost someone irreplaceable. "She's gone," the nurse said softly, checking for a pulse. "I'm so sorry." Sarah sat very still, still holding her mother's hand, which was already beginning to cool. She thought about all the times this hand had held hers. Walking to school on the first day of kindergarten, in the hospital when she had her appendix out at 12, at her father's funeral, through every triumph and heartbreak and ordinary moment of her life. "Goodbye, Mama," she whispered. The funeral was small, just family and a few old friends who remembered Margaret as she'd been before the disease. Sarah gave the eulogy, speaking about her mother's strength, her kindness, her fierce love for her children. "Alzheimer's took a lot from her," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "It took her memories, her independence, her ability to communicate. But it never took her capacity to love or be loved. That remained until the very end." Afterward, at the reception at James's hotel, people shared their memories of Margaret. Stories Sarah had heard before, and some she hadn't. Pieces of her mother's life that she hadn't known about or had forgotten. "She helped me when my husband died," Mrs. Patterson said. "She brought me dinner every night for a month and just sat with me so I wouldn't be alone. She volunteered at the Children's Hospital for years," an old colleague of Margaret's told them. "She would read to the kids for hours. They loved her." These stories were a gift, Sarah realized. They were proof that her mother had mattered, had made a difference, had left marks on the world that wouldn't fade even though her memory had. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah opened the box of recordings she'd made over the past 3 years. Her mother's voice filled the room, telling stories, laughing, singing fragments of old songs. She listened to the last clear conversation they'd had, that Christmas morning when Margaret had been fully present. "Even when I can't remember your name," her mother's voice said, "even when I don't know who you are, I'll still love you. That's the one thing I'm sure of." Sarah closed her eyes and let the tears come, mourning and grateful in equal measure. Mourning for everything that had been lost, grateful for everything she'd had. Over the following weeks and months, Sarah slowly rebuilt her life. She went back to work full-time, reconnected with friends she'd neglected during the long years of caregiving, took up hobbies she'd abandoned. But she also volunteered with the Alzheimer's Association, joined support groups to help others going through what she'd experienced, and donated to research in her mother's name. "Why do you do this?" Dr. Ramirez asked her one day. "Doesn't it bring back painful memories?" "It does," Sarah admitted, "but it also honors her, and maybe somehow, it helps me hold on to her a little bit longer." A year after Margaret's death, Sarah was cleaning out a closet when she found an old shoebox stuffed with letters. They were notes her mother had written over the years, birthday cards, encouraging messages slipped into her lunchbox. A letter Margaret had written to Sarah on the day she left for college. The last item in the box was a sealed envelope with "For Sarah" written on the front in her mother's handwriting. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it. The letter was dated 2 months after the diagnosis, written during one of those early days when Margaret still had enough clarity to understand what was coming. "My dearest Sarah, I'm writing this while I still can, while I still have the words to tell you what you need to know. By the time you read this, I may not remember writing it. I may not remember much of anything, but I want you to know some things and I want you to have them in writing, something concrete you can hold on to. First, being your mother has been the greatest joy of my life. From the moment you were born, you have been my heart walking around outside my body. Every accomplishment of yours felt like my own. Every pain you felt, I felt twice over. I know what's coming will be hard for you, harder than anything you faced before. You will watch me disappear, and you will feel helpless and angry and heartbroken. You will question whether you're doing enough, whether you're making the right decisions. Let me tell you now, whatever you decide, it will be right. Whatever you do will be enough. Because I know you, Sarah, and I know that you will always act out of love. Don't let guilt eat at you. If you need to put me in a facility, do it without shame. If you need to take time for yourself, do it without hesitation. You cannot pour from an empty cup, sweetheart. Take care of yourself so you can take care of me. When I don't recognize you anymore, and I know that day is coming, please don't think it means I don't love you. Love is deeper than memory, stronger than disease. Even when my mind fails, my heart will remember you. I truly believe that. After I'm gone, I want you to live, Sarah. Really live. Don't let grief consume you. Don't make me your whole world, even in death. Find joy, find love, find purpose. That's what I want for you. That's what I've always wanted. Thank you for being my daughter. Thank you for being you. You have made my life better in every conceivable way, and I am so, so proud of the woman you've become. I love you forever, Mom. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then held it against her chest and cried. But this time, they were healing tears, the kind that wash away some of the pain and leave something like peace in their wake. Her mother had known. She had understood what was coming and had tried in her final moments of clarity to make it easier. It was the last gift Margaret had given her, and perhaps the most precious. Sarah carefully placed the letter back in the envelope and put it in her bedside drawer, somewhere she could reach for it on the hard days, on the days when the grief felt overwhelming. That night she dreamed of her mother again, but this time Margaret was young and healthy, the way she'd been in the old photographs. They were standing in a garden Sarah didn't recognize, surrounded by flowers in bloom. "I have to go now," Margaret said, and she was smiling. "I know," Sarah replied. "You're going to be okay." "I know that too." Margaret reached out and touched Sarah's face, a gesture of such tenderness that Sarah felt it even in sleep. "Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for loving me through it all." "It was my privilege," Sarah said, and meant it. When she woke, the grief was still there. It would always be there in some form. But so was something else. Gratitude for the time they'd had, for the love they'd shared, for the privilege of being Margaret Chen's daughter. Alzheimer's had taken her mother's memory, her words, her recognition. But it hadn't taken everything. Love remained. Connection remained. The bond between them remained, unbreakable even by disease, undiminished even by death. Sarah got out of bed and opened her curtains, letting the morning light flood into her apartment. Outside, the world was continuing, indifferent to her loss, but also full of possibility. She thought about her mother's letter, about the instruction to really live. It would be hard, but she would try. She would honor her mother not just through grief, but through joy. Not just through remembering, but through living. "I won't forget you, Mom," Sarah whispered to the empty room. "I promise I'll never forget." And she knew it was true. Memory was more than what resided in the brain. It lived in the heart, in the hands, in the habits and choices we carry forward. Her mother lived on in Sarah's compassion, her strength, her capacity to love even when it hurt. That was what remained when everything else was stripped away. That was what Alzheimer's, for all its cruelty, could never truly take. Love, always love.